I need the fuel kids or the force kids. How many of those do we have? Any teenagers? Why don't you guys come on up? I need your help this morning. You guys are going to help me make this interesting. Sophia, come on up. You know you're up here. Mason, you don't have to if you don't want to, because you haven't looked like a teenager like ever. So, but if you want, you can. He kind of skipped that. All right, how many of you guys have ever played Simon Says? All right, turn around, face me. We're going to play Simon Says this morning, all right? You guys know the rules of Simon Says? You got to do whatever Simon says, and then if don't do what Simon doesn't say. All right, and if you do it without Simon saying it, you have to sit down. I think that's basically the rules. All right? All right, so let's start this out. Richard, I need you up here because you lead these guys, so you might as well have in on the fun. Well, you want your leader up here too, right? You don't want. What, buddy? You gotta. All right. The trick is to get out early first, then you can scoot out. All right. Simon Says, pat your head. Simon Says, pat your knee. Simon Says, touch your head. No, you're right. You're there. All right, now touch your knee. See ya! All right. Simon Says, turn around. Simon Says, jump on one foot. All right, stop. You're out. All right. No, Simon didn't say fall. All right, Simon Says, stop. Simon Says, touch your toes. Simon Says, touch your head. Touch your knees. Oh, you guys, you're out. So you can go to the bathroom now. All right, get these two girls in the middle here. They're going to show off. They're going to. Simon Says didn't move the girls to the middle. So you're both out. All right, you guys may sit down. Go sit down. Now, why in the world would we begin church with a game of Simon Says? Beyond the fact that it's a wicked fun game. Because I guess part of the reason is for years many of us have approached church in a very similar way where it maybe not Simon Says, but it's Jesus Says. Jesus says do this. Jesus says pray. Jesus says go to church. Jesus says do this. Jesus says don't look at that. You looked over there. Now you got to go to the men's group. We have all these rules that we've set up, and that's a way that oftentimes we approach God. And the reality is, you really never win the Jesus Says game. Because even if you're trying your best, chances are there's going to be a time in which Jesus says do something, and for whatever reason we don't, and then we're out. And even if we're doing really, really well, and we're hitting it, just like these last two finalists were doing really, really well, there's even then the tendency to look at those that have fallen out and think how good we're doing because we're still in the game. And in a sense, then we're disqualified as well. Oftentimes we end up simply feeling a little bit more guilty and inadequate than when we started, when we approach our relationship with God by simply, as a rules-based, Jesus Says game. And as we navigate through this series of messages, I want us to just try for a few moments to set aside some of our religious experience or history, either good or bad, and just look at Christ as how He is presented in the Gospels. How the guys of Matthew and Mark, Luke and John had experienced being with Him and wrote about His story, about how He interacted with people and how He responded to people. And I think you'll quickly discover that Jesus was incredibly relational and wants more than anything else, even more than doing everything that He said to do is to be connected with us. For example, there's a few ways that the relationship that Jesus desires for us to have with Him and His Father is depicted in Scripture. The first is that of a father and a child. One of the purposes that Jesus came in the flesh, that Scriptures talk about, is to reveal God to us, to show us, in a sense, God the Father in the flesh, a tangible way to live out the character and the nature of a loving, sacrificial Father God. And to do so in the context of real life. To be able to interact with people, and those that are broken, and those that are hurting, and those that aren't broken, those that are wealthy, and see how would God react in any given situation. That was one of the reasons Jesus came to this earth. To show what it is like between the Father and the Son. John's Gospel records this. I'm praying, and this is Jesus speaking, I'm praying not only for these disciples, but also for all who will ever believe in me through their message. That would be us. I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one. As you are in me, Father, I am in you. And may they be in us, so that the world will believe you sent me. I have given them the glory you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one. And then earlier in John's Gospel, chapter 14, he says, anyone who has seen me, this is Jesus speaking, has seen the Father. So one of the relationships that Jesus tried to depict and to characterize and to emulate was this father-son relationship, this connection that a father would have with his child. Another illustration that Jesus uses is the vine and the branch, of this interdependent relationship that the vine has with the branch, that its sustenance comes from, its life comes from being grafted in or tied or connected to the life-giving source found in the vine. He says it in John chapter 15, remain in me and I remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it's severed from the vine. And you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. Yes, I'm the vine and you are the branches. Those who remain in me and I then in them will produce much fruit. Again, there's this interdependence. There's this provisional relationship, but it only comes when there's an ongoing connection, if you will, relational connection with Christ. Another picture that he depicts in the Scripture of the kind of relationship that he wants us to have with him is the sheep and the shepherd. Now again, most of us are not shepherds. Most of us are not interacting with sheep on an ongoing basis. But if we were, we would discover that the shepherd cares for the sheep, looks over the sheep, protects the sheep, so on and so forth. But he also, the Scriptures talk about how the sheep recognize the shepherd's voice because they're in relationship, because they spend time together. I find myself sometimes talking with people that are in the midst of tremendous chaos in their journeys. They're like, I just can't hear God and I can't figure out God in the midst of this storm, if you will. And oftentimes the reason is not because of the fierceness of the storm, but because they hadn't cultivated a hearing voice or ear to the voice of the shepherd in the midst of the calm. Because I can tell you right now, when my kids were little, I don't care how many kids were screaming in the nursery. When it was mine, I knew it was mine. Because I had learned to discern their scream. Because I had spent much time with it over the years. These are all examples of how Jesus invites us to relate with Him. So if your approach to God in Christianity is always and only about rules, in this Jesus says kind of approach to God, this series or these messages could actually, potentially, hopefully, be life-changing. Because what you see in the person of Christ and how He interacts with people is He's all about relating to us relationally. And that's how He wants us to connect to Him. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do what Jesus has asked us to do. Of course, we need to do what God has asked us to do, what Jesus has asked us to do. But our doing is a reflection of our relationship with Him, not the basis by which we know God. And there's a huge difference. Throughout the Gospels, the word that is used over and over to see how Jesus connects with people is this idea or this word follow. Jesus invites all kinds of people to follow Him. Rich people are invited to follow Christ. Poor people are invited to follow Christ. Religious people, irreligious people were invited to follow Christ. He invited priests, but He also invited prostitutes. He invited lepers, lunatics, men, women, slave, free. Anyone could be a potential follower of Christ, regardless if they started out doing the rules or not. The religious establishment had all kinds of rules that they followed, and they debated over which was the greatest in the list of these rules of how they should be prioritized and which is the most important. And Jesus said, just follow me. One of the quintessential examples of this idea is found in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 9. And it's probably not a new event per se, but I want us to kind of dig down and see if we can't unpack some of this so that we might understand how God is asking us to follow Him as well. As Jesus was walking along, He saw a man named Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. Now for us, we read this and we think, all right, well, he's going up and there's a tax collector there, and later on He invites him to follow him. Now for us, none of us here typically likes to see an IRS agent knocking on our door. You know, we know if all of a sudden the door opens and we see that he's got a badge that says IRS, chances are it's probably not a good visit. He probably doesn't have cookies that he's bringing us. But it doesn't bring up this visceral hatred for the guy necessarily. Most of us, if we see an IRS agent knocking on our door, we're thinking to ourselves, well, he's just doing his job, or she's just doing her job. But in this culture, it was very, very different. Matter of fact, someone maybe in our culture that we would have the same kind of emotional response would be the 22-year-old dropout that's hanging behind the middle school selling drugs to our kids. And we think that that guy is like the lowest of the low. He shouldn't exist. He shouldn't get a pass. He shouldn't have mercy. He's hooking our little kids on some kind of chemical or something to pad his own pocket because he couldn't get his own job and make something of his life. He's a joke. He should be thrown away, in jail someplace, and dealt with, like the scum of society should be. That's the same kind of reaction oftentimes that would accompany a tax collector by a Jewish person. The tax collector was a crook. He would buy the right to collect taxes for Rome for a specific region, if you will, and he could collect as much as he wanted with a full brunt of the Roman army behind him as long as Rome got their portion that was required to be turned in. If Rome required 10%, but this tax collector required 30%, you had to pay 30, he kept 20. As long as Rome got their 10, they didn't care. He was a traitor. He was actively supporting and working for the oppressive, occupying Roman Empire. But he was also a partier. Tax collectors were known for lavish parties. And they would, where wine flowed and women were available. All paid for with your dime or your shekel. Although their heritage was Jewish, their lifestyle rejected and mocked the commands and the values of Judaism, to the point where tax collectors were not even allowed in the temple. They were seen as outcasts. Now, with this as a backdrop, Jesus sees and approaches Matthew at his tax collecting booth, and he could have said a number of things. I would have, if it was me, I probably would have said something sarcastic, something smart mouth. Oh, Matthew, I'm sure your dad's proud. Way to go. But Jesus doesn't. He says, follow me and be my disciple. So Matthew got up and he followed him. To which we immediately want to object and say it can't be that simple. It can't be that simple. You can't just do all that junk and then get an invitation to follow Christ and then to get up and just simply follow him. Jesus wasn't inviting him simply to lunch. He was asking him and inviting him to be a part of his inner circle, one of his students, one of his disciples, one of his followers. To maybe give some insight, in first century education, the rabbi and the disciple was a very special relationship. To get the full understanding, we need to understand a little bit the process of education for a kid in Galilee during this time. Galileans were typically very highly educated. Most of them were in school for at least a portion of their lives. Boys studied the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Girls typically studied Psalms, Proverbs, and Deuteronomy. If the boys memorized the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, by the time they were 12, they were oftentimes invited to continue their education. Typically, girls by that time would marry, and so their education would be over. But from the age of 12 to 15, boys would study and learn a trade from their dad and their family, but they would also continue their studies. Now, at age 15, if the boy could find a rabbi who would take them, they would become a follower or a Talmud of that special rabbi, a student. And so these boys that were especially bright and smart and had potential, they would approach these rabbis and say, am I worthy of being one of your disciples? In other words, do I have what it takes to become like you? Do you see enough in me that you'd be willing to invest yourself into my life to continue my education so that I might someday emulate your actions, your behavior, and become a rabbi just like you? When Jesus calls his disciples, they were all working in the family trade, which gives us the indication that if they had approached a rabbi, he basically said, I think you'd better go work for Dad. I don't see in you what I need to see in you for you to be one of my students, one of my disciples. And I think it's interesting then that Jesus broke this pattern and he chose his disciples. Jesus says in John chapter 15, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you might go bear fruit, and fruit that will last. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. These guys, for all practical purposes, probably did ask several rabbis, and they all said no. Jesus sees them working in their Father's trade and says, I will choose you and make you like me. But you got to follow me. You want to be my student? Follow me. And see, Jesus does the same thing to us. Many of us, we recognize that we don't have what it takes. We can't follow every rule and every regulation that's ever been established and do it without fault and without mistake. In and of ourselves, we don't have the credentials. In and of ourselves, we don't have the capacity to live a sinless, perfect life. Jesus says, that's all right. I chose you. Follow me. And again, if it's us, we typically would say, well, if you want to be a part of us, then here are these 4 classes I need you to attend. You need to get rid of that habit. You need to stop doing that. Those clothes really aren't appropriate. And what were you thinking with your hair? Now, fix that stuff. And I don't know what you got going on with that nose or that ear or that tongue, but get that thing out of it. And then come see us, and we'll bring you through the membership class. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't take Matthew. He sees him as a legitimate candidate just as he was, and simply says, follow me. What if we started there? What if we simply started by asking the question, am I following Jesus? Later on, Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, and it's worth noting that Jesus is willing to go to Matthew's house, which would possibly ruin his reputation, in order to connect with Matthew and his friends. And in this setting, Jesus was comfortable. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. I think it's amusing that the writer of this gospel, Matthew, chose to separate tax collectors from sinners. I don't know if Matthew just didn't want to offend his sinner friends by calling them tax collectors, or the other way around. I'm not sure. But Jesus finds himself there, and this became a really, really big deal. The reason is Jesus was very comfortable in this setting with people who were nothing like him, seemingly. And people who were nothing like Jesus were very comfortable being with him. Which begs the question that why are so many outside the church seem to be so uncomfortable when they're at church? If the church is full of those who are claiming to be followers of Christ and are endeavoring to be like their rabbi, then why aren't those that are irreligious so uncomfortable around seemingly religious people? Knowing the sinfulness of Matthew, knowing the vile choices that he's made and the less than perfect company that he's kept, Jesus still invites him to follow him and become one of his personal apprentices. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked the disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? And in Jesus hearing this, he said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Now, again, I sit there and I'm thinking, well, Jesus, you're sick. You say that, and all these people you just called these people you're eating with sick. And maybe it's just me in my mind's eye, but I can almost imagine Matthew going up to him and saying, Jesus, what's the deal? I bring you to my house, then you call my friends and me sick? And Jesus just kind of turns to Matthew in my own head. Matthew, you're a tax collector. Come on. You're right. See, people who are sinners, people who are deep in the throes of their junk, they know that they're sinners. We know when we mess up. Nobody has to remind us of this fact. We know that oftentimes our lives are a mess if we're honest with ourselves when we're living a life without God. We don't need to all of a sudden become the sin police and remind those that are outside the family of God, that are outside, that living in the world, if you will, that their lives are messed up. They know that. Jesus goes on, he says, but go learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus was not content to hang out with those that only believed the same way that he did. This is incredibly important for the church to understand. Because if we miss this and we become content with only hanging out and being with those that believe the way that we believe and think the way that we think, we'll find ourselves on the outside of where Jesus is hanging out. See, the Pharisees' message of the day and the same Pharisees' message of this day is change and you can join us. Change and you can join us. Change how you dress, change how you do your hair, change what's pierced, change how you talk, change where you hang out, change what you look at, change all that stuff. And then you'll be allowed to join our club. That was the message of the Pharisee. And oftentimes, it's the message of the church today. Jesus shows up and he flips that message upside down and he says this: join us, follow me, and you will change. No matter what you look like, no matter what family you're a part of, no matter what your occupation is, no matter what you've done wrong, no matter who you are, what you are, follow me and see what happens. The approach drove the Pharisees then and now crazy. Because for generations their approach was connect with God, was through believing the right stuff and behaving in a certain way. And in the end, you take a quiz, and if you pass, we'll let you join. And Jesus throws that out the window, saying, I really don't care what you believe. I don't even care how you've behaved. I want you to invite me to follow me. I want to invite you to follow me. But I need you to warn you, if you follow me, there may be some differences that ends up showing up in your life. Because my relationship with you is more personal. It's like a father and a son relationship. You're not out the first time you mess up. Anytime, just like our kids aren't out the first time they mess up. Because they're our kids. He says, not only that, but my relationship with you, it's like a providential relationship where I want to pour myself into you. I want to take care of you. I want to provide for you. Just like that branch is taken care of by the vine, that's the same kind of connection that I want with you. And if you want to produce fruit, I'm not going to cut you off from the very life source that produces fruit. I want you to be tied into me. Not the first time you don't bear fruit, I'm not going to cut you off and send you off. I want you to remain in me. That's the kind of relationship I want you to have with me. I want to provide for you. And he goes, not just that. I want to protect you. See, I'm not trying to keep you from all the fun. I'm trying to protect you from the inevitable consequences that comes when you reject my counsel and the heartache that it brings into your life. I'm trying to protect you just like a shepherd would his sheep. That's what I'm trying to provide. Follow me. And just like, remember, David would put himself in harm's way to protect his sheep, that's the kind of relationship that I want to have with you. It's not that I'm trying to keep you from having all these great experiences, but I know the devourer. I'm intimately acquainted with the adversary and his agenda for your life. So follow me and let my protection cover you. So let me just close with a few things for us to consider. First of all, being a sinner does not disqualify us from being a follower of Christ. Being a sinner does not disqualify us from being a follower of Christ. Matter of fact, it's a prerequisite. We've got to admit that we need our Savior. We have to admit the fact that we can't stand before God in our own righteousness and our own self-sufficiency. So not only does it doesn't disqualify us, it's a requirement. To be a follower of Christ, you've got to begin as a sinner. Being an unbeliever doesn't disqualify you. Having doubts, having concerns doesn't disqualify us. Ask Thomas. The invitation to follow is an invitation to relationship. I love how Paul puts it in the 2nd chapter of Romans. He says, don't you see how wonderfully kind and tolerant and patient God is with you? Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that His kindness is intended to turn you from your sin? It's the kindness of God that exposes, oftentimes, the futility of our own efforts and the sinfulness of our own hearts. Have you ever experienced someone's kindness in just a real, pure, genuine way? They had no agenda. They had no desire for anything back. They just wanted to be kind. Isn't the natural response to that to want to be in a relationship? I want to be around people like that. I want to be around kind people. I don't know, but I don't look for miserable people. Man, I'd like to hang with that guy. That guy is miserable all the time. He's angry. He's bitter. He just hates life. He hates people. Man, I wonder if he'll take me to lunch. So some of his junk can just kind of spill over into my lap. That's just. Hey, come to my church and be miserable like me. Really? There's 5 turkeys. All right, maybe. But I mean, think about it. It was the kindness of God that, in a sense, drew us to a place of repentance. The other part that I want us to close with, and this is the piece that oftentimes the Pharisee in each of us kind of gristles with these kinds of messages, because you're sitting there going, well, that's fine. You want to be a follower of Christ? That's fine. Be a follower of Christ. It sounds good. I get what you're saying. But you've got to do something to reflect the fact that you're being a follower. How do you just be a follower? You've got to be a follower by doing certain rules. Yes, but following also forces me to focus on where I am and not where you're not. And that's a huge distinction. Because I don't care if you've been following Christ for 30 years or 30 minutes. If you're following Him and you're focused on the log in your eye and you're working on your own stuff as it relates to Christ and how can I be more like Him, then we're going to be less apt to say to the guy who's been following for 30 minutes, listen, you've got this little thing in your eye that I need to get out. Jesus Himself said, deal with the log in your own before you start doing surgery on somebody else's. If we're focused on trying to be like Him, we're going to be less apt to try to point out the junk in somebody else's life. And that's the difference. The Pharisees made a career out of pointing out people's junk in their lives and how they thought they should fix it, instead of being a follower of God. Can you imagine the impact that could have on churches in communities that began to get the reputation that it's not about your junk, but it's about our own stuff and our ability to touch God? I heard it said this way, if getting into heaven, if having a relationship with God meant all you had to do was jump up and touch the moon, some of us would get closer to that goal than others. Right? Some of us could jump off the ground and probably 2 feet off the ground. Some of us. I'm looking at this crowd thinking, not quite sure which one, but some of us maybe could jump up a couple feet and get really, really high on the wall. Some of us, less, not so much that much, a little less. But the reality is, I don't care if you get a vertical leap of 3 feet or 5 feet or 2 inches. We're still not even close to touching the moon. So it doesn't matter if our sinfulness holds us an inch off the ground or our righteousness supposedly gets us 3 feet off the ground. We're still not touching the moon. We are still hopelessly short of what we would need for righteousness. But what we do is we go, dude, you only got an inch off the ground. What is your problem? Look at mine. I'm 3 inches off the ground. And we're all excited about our 3 inches. And Jesus is going, dude, you got miles to go. And it's just, you're wasting your time comparing how well you do or how far you fall short. Am I a follower of Christ? Am I actively endeavoring to follow my Lord?